In the scorched heart of Texas, in the year 1868, the past was not a distant country but a landscape of fresh graves and unhealed wounds. The war had left behind more than just widows and orphans. It had created a generation of ghosts, children swallowed by the chaos, whose names were now spoken only in the hushed tones of prayer. This is the story of one such ghost who returned not as a whisper on the wind, but as a solid, silent presence in the very home that had lost her. She came disguised in the humble garments of a servant to a family so consumed by their grief that they could not see the truth they had begged God for, even as it served them their supper. If the unmarked graves of history call to you, and you are new to this archive, subscribe to join those who listen for the stories that were never meant to be told. The road to the Alvarado Ranch was less a road and more a scar upon the land. It was a wide, pale gash of pulverized caliche and sun-baked dust that shimmered in the relentless heat. For 3 years, the rains had failed to come, and the vast expanse of central Texas had been baked into a state of brittle resignation. The sky was a vast, empty bowl of faded blue, bleached of color by a sun that felt less like a source of life and more like a malevolent, white-hot eye. The mesquite trees that dotted the landscape were twisted, skeletal things, their leaves withered to the texture of ancient parchment. The wind, when it stirred, did not offer relief, but instead carried clouds of fine, gritty dust that coated everything, filling the eyes and lungs, and settling like a shroud over the cracked, thirsty earth. The silence was profound, broken only by the incessant, high-pitched drone of cicadas and the dry rustle of the wind through skeletal grasses. This was a land of waiting, a place where life had been pared down to the raw essentials of endurance. It was a fitting landscape for the arrival of a specter. She arrived on foot, a solitary figure moving through the shimmering heat haze. She was not announced, had not been sent for. She simply appeared at the end of the long, dust-choked drive that led to the main house of the Alvarado Ranch, her form wavering in the afternoon glare. The ranch hands, mending tack in the sliver of shade offered by the long overhang of the barn, stopped their work to watch her approach. She was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with a stillness about her that was at odds with the arduousness of her journey. Her dress was of a dark, indeterminate color, faded by the sun and layered with the pale dust of the road. She carried a small, tightly wrapped bundle, and her face was partially obscured by a plain bonnet, but it was her posture that drew the eye. She walked with a straight-backed, deliberate gait, her head held high, a posture not of defiance, but of a deep, ingrained self-possession that seemed out of place in a lone woman seeking work. It was Isabel Alvarado who met her on the wide, sun-blasted veranda of the ranch house. The mistress of the house was a woman who had once been known for her vibrant spirit, but grief had leached the color from her as surely as the drought had from the land. Her dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and her eyes, the color of dark honey, were perpetually shadowed by a sorrow that had become the central feature of her face. She spent most of her days on this veranda, rocking slowly in a chair that faced the empty road, as if expecting a visitor who was years overdue. When she saw the young woman standing at the bottom of the steps, her rocking ceased. The girl stated her purpose in a voice that was low and even, devoid of any pleading or desperation. She said that her name was Anna, and that she had heard the Alvarados were in need of a new maid. She explained that she could cook, clean, and mend, and that she was a hard worker who required little. Isabel studied the stranger with a strange intensity. There was a desperate need for help. The previous maid had left 2 months prior, driven away by the oppressive silence and the relentless grief that clung to the house like the dust. Yet Isabel hesitated, a flicker of some unidentifiable emotion stirring within her. It was a feeling of uncanny familiarity, a disorienting sense of echo. It was in the way the girl stood, with her weight settled on one hip, a posture so achingly familiar. And there was a small, pale scar, a tiny crescent-shaped line just above her right eyebrow, almost hidden by the shadow of her bonnet. Isabel felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a physical jolt as if a cold hand had been placed on the back of her neck. She had seen that scar before, or one just like it, on another face, in another lifetime. She pushed the thought away, dismissing it as a trick of the light, a figment of a mind that was perpetually sifting through the ashes of memory. She knew that her husband, Matteo, would question the wisdom of hiring a complete stranger, a woman who had appeared out of the dust with no references and no past. But the household was in disarray, and the sheer weight of managing it alone had become unbearable. Isabel made her decision. She told the girl she was hired, her voice more weary than she intended. She showed Anna to a small, spare room at the back of the house, a space that was little more than a cell, containing a narrow cot and a small washstand. The girl accepted her new quarters with a quiet nod, her face revealing nothing. That evening, the whispers began among the ranch hands. They were gathered around their fire pit as the sun set, painting the western sky in brutal streaks of orange and purple. The foreman, a man named Calder, was the keeper of the ranch's history. He was a lean, weathered man who had been with the Alvarados for 20 years, his loyalty to the family as solid and unyielding as the hard-packed earth beneath his boots. He had been there 7 years ago, in the chaotic final years of the war when lawlessness was the only law. It was Calder who quietly recounted the story to a new hand, a young man who knew nothing of the family's tragedy. He spoke of the Alvarados' daughter, a girl named Elena. He described her as a child of 10, with her mother's honey-colored eyes and a wild, fearless spirit. He told of the day the raiders had come, a band of deserters and opportunists who had swept through the outlying ranches like a plague of locusts. He explained how they had taken livestock, provisions, and anything of value. And, he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, they had taken the child. Matteo and a posse of ranchers had ridden after them for 3 days, but the trail had gone cold in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the hill country. They had found nothing, not a ribbon, not a footprint. The girl had vanished from the earth, swallowed whole by the violence of the times. The official assumption was that she was dead. But in the heart of the ranch, in the quiet, unspoken spaces, another possibility was allowed to exist, that she had been sold, traded, her identity erased, condemned to a life of servitude in some distant, unknown place. The arrival of the new maid, a stranger of the same approximate age Elena would have been, had stirred these old, dormant fears and hopes. The first supper Anna served was a quiet, somber affair. The dining room of the Alvarado Ranch was a place of ghosts. It was a large, high-ceilinged room, dominated by a long, dark wood table that could comfortably seat 12, though now it was set for only 2. The heavy velvet curtains were perpetually drawn, shutting out the harsh glare of the Texas sun and creating a space that felt sepulchral and still. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that penetrated the gloom, and the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old, unspoken sorrow. Matteo Alvarado sat at the head of the table, a man who had been eroded by grief. He was broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, but the strength in his frame seemed to have been hollowed out, leaving behind a brittle shell. He rarely spoke, his silence a wall he had built around himself, a fortress against a world that had dealt him an unforgivable blow. Isabel sat at the opposite end, the vast, polished expanse of the table, a physical representation of the distance that had grown between them. Anna moved around the room with a silent, ghostly efficiency. She brought in a tureen of simple beef stew and placed it on the sideboard. She ladled it into their bowls, her movements precise and unhurried. As she placed the bowl before Isabel, her sleeve brushed against the older woman's hand, and Isabel felt another irrational jolt of recognition. The girl's skin was cool, and her presence was a strange mixture of deference and an almost unnerving self-assurance. As they began to eat, a strange thing happened. Matteo, who had not said grace at this table since the day his daughter had been taken, suddenly paused, his spoon halfway to his lips. He cleared his throat and, in a low, rusty voice, began to recite the old family prayer, a prayer for protection and for the safe return of those who are lost. His eyes were fixed on his plate, but the words were directed into the heavy silence of the room, a spontaneous eruption of a ritual long abandoned. Isabel looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a nascent, terrifying hope. She looked from her husband's bowed head to the new maid, who stood perfectly still by the sideboard, her hands clasped before her, her face in shadow. The quiet stranger had been in their home for less than a day, and already the locked-away rituals of their buried past were beginning to surface, unbidden. The first supper had been served, and with it, a question that would come to haunt the very foundations of the house. Was this quiet girl a servant, a stranger, or was she something else entirely? A memory made flesh returned to the table where her absence had become the most powerful presence of all. The arrival of the new maid did not break the oppressive silence of the Alvarado ranch. It merely changed its texture. Before, the silence had been a dead weight, the sound of absence. Now, it was a watchful, anticipatory thing, filled with the soft, almost imperceptible sounds of Anna's presence. The rustle of her dress in the hallway, the soft click of a door closing, the gentle scrape of a pot being scrubbed in the kitchen. She moved through the house, not like a servant, but like a river finding its old, forgotten course, her movements economical and imbued with a quiet, unnerving purpose. The house itself, which had for 7 years been a reliquary of grief, a museum of a single, catastrophic loss, seemed to stir around her. The air, once stagnant with sorrow, now seemed to hum with a low electric current of possibility, a feeling that was equal parts hope and terror. Anna's domain was the kitchen, a large, stone-floored room at the back of the house, where the heat of the day seemed to collect and fester. Here, she worked with a methodical, focused intensity that was both admirable and unsettling. She seemed to require no instruction. On her first morning, she located the flour, the salt, the smoked meats, and the stores of dried beans, as if she were returning to a space she had known her entire life. She did not ask where things were kept, she simply knew. This unnerving prescience was the first of many small, inexplicable details that began to accumulate in Isabel's mind, forming a constellation of impossible facts. Isabel would watch her from the doorway, her heart a tight, painful knot in her chest. She watched Anna knead dough on the thick butcher block table, her hands moving with a practiced, rhythmic grace. She saw the way the girl would occasionally push a stray strand of dark hair from her face with the back of her wrist, a gesture so achingly, devastatingly familiar that it made Isabel feel as though she were suffocating. The first true test, the first piece of evidence that could not be dismissed as coincidence or a trick of a grief-addled mind, came in the form of a simple beef stew. It was a staple meal on the ranch, a dish Isabel had made hundreds of times. Her recipe was a legacy from her own mother, hearty and plain. But Elena, even as a child, had possessed a peculiar palate. She had always insisted that the stew was not complete without an extra, seemingly excessive, measure of salt and a sprig of wild oregano that grew only near the dry creek bed at the far edge of the property. She would sneak into the kitchen when her mother was not looking and make her additions, a small, defiant act of culinary personalization. Isabel had not made the stew in 7 years. The memory was too painful. When she saw Anna preparing the ingredients one afternoon, she felt a pang of the old sorrow. She left the kitchen, unable to watch. Later, when the meal was served, Isabel lifted the spoon to her lips with a sense of weary resignation. But the flavor that met her tongue was not the one she expected. It was her stew, yes, but it was altered. It carried the distinct, sharp tang of too much salt and the earthy, aromatic undertone of wild oregano. It was Elena's stew. Isabel's spoon clattered against the cracked blue willow china of her plate, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent dining room. She looked up at her husband, but Mateo's face was a mask of stoic indifference, his eyes fixed on his meal. He either did not notice or, more likely, refused to. But Isabel knew. The oregano did not grow near the house. A stranger could not have known to look for it, let alone have understood its ritualistic importance to a child who was long gone. This uncanny knowledge extended to the smallest domestic rituals. Anna would set the long dining table not according to formal rules, but according to a forgotten, unwritten code of family habit. She placed Mateo's water glass slightly to the right of his plate, just as he had always preferred, a quirk he had never mentioned to any previous servant. She arranged the silverware with a precision that was not merely neat, but deeply personal. And the napkins. Elena had developed a specific, complicated way of folding the linen napkins, a shape that resembled a clumsy, long-necked bird. It was a silly, childish habit that Isabel had indulged, and after Elena was gone, she had gone back to a simple square fold, the sight of the little birds being too much to bear. On the third night, when Isabel and Mateo came to the table, they found 2 linen birds waiting for them, their long necks craned towards the center of the table, exactly as they had been 7 years before. This time, Mateo did react. He stared at the napkin for a long, silent moment, his jaw tight. Then, with a single, sharp, angry movement, he snatched it up and threw it onto his lap, unfolding it with a violence that betrayed the tremor in his hands. He did not speak of it, but a crack had appeared in the fortress of his denial. For Isabel, the house was no longer a tomb, but a puzzle box, and she had begun to search for the keys. Her hope, a thing she had thought long dead and buried, was a painful, terrifying rebirth. It made her feel frantic, unmoored. She started to follow Anna, to watch her with a desperate, obsessive focus. She would observe the way the girl mended the household linens, her stitches small and even, her hands never idle. One afternoon, while sorting through a pile of freshly laundered napkins, Isabel's fingers brushed against an unfamiliar texture in the hem of one of the older, more worn pieces. It was a small, hard knot of thread. Her heart began to pound a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. With trembling fingers, she carefully worked the threads apart. Stitched into the interior of the hem, almost invisible to a casual glance, was a small, lopsided star with 5 uneven points. It was a clumsy, childish design, a secret mark. It was Elena's mark. Isabel sank onto a nearby chair, the napkin clutched in her hand, the room seeming to tilt around her. She was transported back a decade, to a memory as vivid as a waking dream. She saw Elena, a girl of 8, sitting under the shade of the veranda, a needle and thread in her small hands. She was diligently stitching this same imperfect star onto the corner of her doll's blanket. When Isabel had asked her what she was doing, the child had looked up, her honey-colored eyes serious and proud, and had explained that this was her sign, so that her things would always know how to find their way back to her if they were ever lost. The memory was so powerful, so complete, that Isabel could almost smell the sun-baked dust and the sweet scent of the honeysuckle that had once grown along the railing. How could this stranger, this girl named Anna, know of a secret sign that had existed only in the private world of a long-lost child? The question was no longer whether she was seeing patterns in the static of her grief. The patterns were real. They were being laid out before her, one by one, a trail of clues that led toward a conclusion so impossible that to even consider it felt like a form of madness. Mateo remained a bastion of resistance, his grief having calcified into a hard, protective shell of disbelief. He saw the changes in his wife, the frantic, hopeful light that had begun to dawn in her eyes, and it terrified him. Hope was the enemy. Hope had been the thing that had tormented him for years, the cruel whisper that had kept him riding out to chase down false leads, to question strangers in dusty towns, to stare into the faces of lost children until their features blurred into a meaningless collage of disappointment. He had made a conscious decision to kill that hope, to accept his daughter's death as the only way to survive his own life. Anna's presence and Isabel's reaction to it threatened to undo that grim, necessary work. He avoided the girl, refusing to speak to her directly, his orders delivered through his wife. He tried to see her as just another maid, a drifter who had, by some cruel coincidence, stumbled upon a few of the household's old habits. But his defenses were not as strong as he believed. One night, the oppressive heat of the day lingered long after sunset, refusing to relinquish its hold on the house. Sleep was impossible. Mateo found himself in his small study, a bottle of whiskey and a single glass on the desk before him, the ghosts of his past his only companions. The house was utterly still, the only sound the rhythmic drone of the cicadas outside the window, a sound that seemed to be the very pulse of the heat. And then he heard it. It was faint at first, a soft, melodic thread of sound weaving its way through the heavy silence. It was a woman's voice, humming. He froze, the glass halfway to his lips. He strained to hear, tilting his head. The melody was achingly familiar. It was a lullaby, an old Spanish tune that had been passed down through his family for generations. A song his grandmother had sung to him as a boy. It was a tune with a strange, complex rhythm and a melancholy air, not a common nursery rhyme. He had sung it to only one person in his entire life. He had sung it to Elena, every night, until the night she was taken. He rose from his chair, his movements stiff, silent. He followed the sound out of his study and down the long, dark hallway. It grew stronger as he approached the back of the house, leading him to the closed door of Anna's room. He stood outside, his ear pressed against the rough, splintery wood. The humming was clear now, unmistakable. It was not a half-remembered fragment. She was humming the entire complex melody, note for perfect note. He could hear every subtle shift in cadence, every melancholic turn of phrase, exactly as he had sung it. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his hand resting on the cool metal of the doorknob, his knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at him to throw the door open, to confront her, to demand an answer. But what was the question? And what answer could he possibly bear to hear? To accept the implication of that song would be to accept a miracle, and he no longer believed in them. To accept it would be to let hope back in, and he knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that if that hope proved to be false, it would not just wound him this time, it would utterly destroy him. He backed away from the door as if it were the entrance to a tomb, his heart pounding a wild, panicked rhythm against his ribs. He retreated to his study, but the wall of his denial had been breached. The ghost of a song had found its way through the cracks, and he knew that the silence he had so carefully cultivated could not hold for much longer. The final, irrefutable sign came a week later. It was not an echo or a whisper, but a deliberate, almost confrontational act. In Isabel's bedroom stood a large, cedar-lined trunk. It was a heavy, dust-covered object that had once been Elena's hope chest, a place where she had kept her most precious childhood possessions. The trunk had been locked on the day of her disappearance, and the key had been hidden away in Isabel's jewelry box, untouched for 7 years. It was the house's most sacred and inviolable space. Driven by a compulsion she no longer tried to understand, Isabel retrieved the key. Her hands shook so violently that it took her 3 attempts to fit it into the lock. With a loud, groaning creak, she lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and dried lavender filled the air, the smell of a childhood sealed away from time. Inside, everything was, as she remembered, yet fundamentally wrong. Elena's treasures were there, a collection of unusually smooth river stones, a small, crudely carved wooden bird, a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, but their arrangement had been altered. A small, tarnished silver locket, which had always been tucked away in a corner, now lay in the very center of the trunk, placed carefully on a square of embroidered linen. A rag doll, which had been lying face down, was now propped up against the side of the trunk, its yarn hair neatly braided. Nothing was missing, but the objects had been curated, their positions shifted with a gentle, knowing hand. It was not the work of a thief. It was the work of someone who understood the sentimental hierarchy of these items, someone who had been inside this trunk before. It was an impossible, silent communication. Isabel stared into the trunk, her breath caught in her throat. The echoes and the whispers had been whispers no longer. This was a clear, deliberate message. The time for passive observation was over. The time for testing, for a direct confrontation with the ghost in their house, had arrived. The discovery of the rearranged keepsakes in the cedar trunk acted as a catalyst, dissolving the last vestiges of Isabel's hesitation. The quiet, passive observation of the past weeks was no longer sufficient. The questions that had been circling in her mind like vultures now demanded to be confronted directly. Hope, once a terrifying and unwelcome specter, had now taken root so deeply in her heart that it felt like a physical ache, a constant, painful pressure behind her ribs. It was a fragile, dangerous thing, this newfound hope, and she knew it could be shattered with a single wrong answer. But the agony of uncertainty had become more unbearable than the prospect of a devastating truth. She resolved to move from observation to interrogation, to set a series of private, carefully constructed trials, designed to either prove the impossible or exorcise this ghost from her house for good. She felt a strange, cold clarity descend upon her, the calm of a gambler about to risk everything on a final, desperate wager. Her first test was one of grief, a trial of a shared, secret sorrow. It took place on a suffocatingly hot afternoon, the air in the house so thick and still it felt difficult to breathe. Isabel found Anna in the small, walled-off garden behind the kitchen, a patch of scorched earth where only the hardiest herbs and a few stubborn, sun-withered roses still clung to life. The girl was methodically pulling weeds, her movements patient and rhythmic, her back to the house. Isabel approached her, her footsteps muffled by the dusty soil. She stood for a moment, watching the girl work, her mind rehearsing the words she had so carefully chosen. She began by speaking of the drought, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet garden. She mentioned how the roses were struggling, how little life the heat had spared. Then, she let her voice drop, imbuing it with a carefully measured note of casual melancholy. She spoke of a canary, a small yellow bird named Pip that Elena had adored. She told a partial truth, saying that the bird had died during the first summer of the drought, its song silenced by the oppressive heat. Then came the test. She mentioned that she had buried it somewhere in the garden, but that the exact spot had slipped her mind in the years since. She wondered aloud if a small, decorative stone cross she had once placed on the grave was still there. Anna did not stop her work immediately. She continued to pull a long, stubborn weed from the ground, her knuckles white with the effort. Then, she slowly rose to her feet, wiping the soil from her hands onto her apron. She did not look at Isabel. Instead, her gaze traveled across the small, barren garden, a slow, methodical survey. Her eyes came to rest on a corner of the garden, near the crumbling adobe wall, where a massive, thorny bougainvillea bush grew in a wild, untamed tangle. It was a part of the garden that Isabel had long neglected, a place where the shadows were deepest. The girl turned to Isabel, her expression as placid and unreadable as ever. She said, in her low, even voice, that there had been no stone cross. She stated that the bird had not been buried under the roses, but beneath the bougainvillea. She added a detail that made the blood freeze in Isabel's veins. She said that the bird had been placed in a small wooden box that had once held Isabel's sewing needles, and that a single, white-veined river stone, one that Elena had believed to be lucky, had been placed on top of the box before the hole was filled in. Every detail was correct. There had been no one present at the burial, except for Isabel and a sobbing, 10-year-old Elena. It was a secret shared only by a mother, her daughter, and the silent earth. Isabel felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She gripped the back of a nearby stone bench to steady herself. The rough, sun-warmed texture of the stone, a small, grounding reality in a world that suddenly felt fluid and unreal. She had her first answer, and it was terrifying. Matteo, witnessing his wife's growing conviction, found his own carefully constructed wall of denial beginning to crumble. Her hope was infectious, a slow-acting poison to his cultivated cynicism. He saw the way she watched the maid, the desperate, hungry look in her eyes, and he knew that he could not remain a passive observer to her quiet, dangerous investigation. He needed his own proof, a test that was rooted not in the feminine world of gardens and keepsakes, but in the harder, more masculine memories of the ranch. He devised his trial with a grim, almost resentful sense of purpose, determined to expose the girl as a clever charlatan, a grifter who had somehow learned a few fragments of their family's past. He cornered her one evening in the stables, where she had gone to fetch a bucket of water. The air was thick with the smells of horse, leather, and dry hay. The last of the evening light slanted through the wide stable doors, illuminating the dust motes that hung in the air like a golden mist. He approached her directly, his tone blunt and accusatory. He did not bother with pleasantries. He told her that he had been thinking about the old days, back when his daughter was a child. He spoke of her love for the horses, how she had practically grown up in these stables. Then he laid his trap. He mentioned an old horse, a fiery sorrel mare with a white blaze on her face. He gave the mare a name, a false one, calling her Morning Star. He said, his eyes narrowed, that Elena had loved that horse more than any other, that she had spent hours brushing its coat until it shone like copper. He watched the girl's face, looking for any flicker of uncertainty, any sign of a guess. Anna stood perfectly still, the wooden bucket held in one hand. She listened patiently until he had finished. Then, with a quiet but unwavering confidence, she corrected him. She stated that the mare he was speaking of was not named Morning Star. She said that its name was Diablo, a name Elena had given it because of its wild, untamable spirit. She went on to say that the horse Elena had truly loved, the one she considered her own, had not been a fiery sorrel, but a gentle, piebald gelding named Patches, a horse that had been sold off a year before the raiders came. Matteo stared at her, his mind reeling. Every word she spoke was the truth. He had invented the name Morning Star on the spot. No ranch hand would have known the story of the two horses. It was a private piece of family lore. The correction was so soft-spoken, yet so absolute, that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He felt the foundations of his disbelief begin to crack and give way, and in their place, a terrifying, exhilarating hope began to rush in, a flood that threatened to drown him. He turned and walked out of the stables without another word, his own heart now a battleground between a lifetime of grief and the impossible evidence of a miracle. The final trial came not from Isabel or Matteo, but from Calder, the foreman. He had been a silent, watchful observer of the events unfolding in the main house, his weathered face a mask of cautious neutrality. He had loved Elena with the gruff, protective affection of a man who has no children of his own. Her loss had been a wound to him as well, a failure of his duty to protect the ranch and all who lived on it. He had watched Anna with a professional skepticism, his eyes missing nothing, his mind weighing the evidence with a slow, deliberate gravity. He had heard the whispers from the other hands, had seen the change in Isabel, and had noted the deep, troubled conflict in Matteo's eyes. He decided that he would be the final arbiter, the one who would deliver the definitive, impartial verdict. His test was an object, a small, tangible piece of the past. It was a spur charm, a small disc of leather onto which Elena, at the age of 9, had clumsily stitched a design of a soaring hawk using brightly colored thread. She had given it to him as a gift, and he had treasured it. The charm had a complex, braided knot for attaching it to his spur, a knot she had been particularly proud of figuring out. A few years ago, the leather braid had broken. He sought out Anna in the late afternoon. As she was sweeping the dust from the long veranda, he approached her not with the deference of a foreman to a member of the household staff, but as an equal, a fellow keeper of the ranch's memories. He held out his hand, his palm open. The broken spur charm lay on his calloused, sun-darkened skin. He did not offer any explanation. He simply said that it was broken. He watched her face, his gaze steady and intense. Anna looked down at the charm. Her sweeping stopped. For the first time since her arrival, a flicker of deep, undeniable emotion crossed her features. It was a flash of profound, sorrowful recognition, a shadow that passed through her eyes and was gone in an instant. She reached out and took the two pieces of the broken charm from his hand. Her fingers, long and nimble, held the pieces for a moment. Then, with a surety of motion that was breathtaking to watch, she began to reweave the broken knot. Her fingers moved with an unconscious, cellular memory, looping and pulling the leather strands into their original, complex pattern. She did not need to study it or guess. She knew the knot. She had tied it once before. In less than a minute, she had finished. She held out the mended charm to him. The knot was complete, exactly as it had been. Calder took the charm, his own hand not quite steady. He looked from the perfectly tied knot to the girl's face. He saw no triumph in her eyes, only a deep, quiet sadness. He had his answer. This was not a clever mimic. This was not a coincidence. This was blood, returned in borrowed clothing. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of profound, world-altering acknowledgement. The trial was over. All the questions had been answered. That evening, as the three of them, Isabel, Matteo, and Calder, sat in the parlor, the room sepulchral at dusk, with dust motes dancing in the last amber shafts of light, Anna entered. She did not wait to be summoned. She stood before them, her hands clasped, her composure absolute, she made a simple, formal request. She asked if, on the following night, she might be permitted to serve them a formal supper. She then added the words that sealed their conviction. She asked to serve it, just once, as it was before. The request was not that of a maid. It was the request of a daughter, asking for permission to finally come home. The time for testing was over. The time for revelation, staged at the very table that had been the site of their deepest grief, was about to begin. The only question that remained was the one that had been hovering in the shadows all along. If she was their child, their lost Elena, why the disguise? And why, after all these silent, empty years, had she chosen to return now? The day of the formal supper unfolded in an atmosphere of excruciatingly tense, unspoken anticipation. The oppressive Texas heat seemed to mirror the emotional pressure building within the walls of the Alvarado ranch house. Outside, the sun beat down from a white, cloudless sky, and the air was so still that not a single leaf stirred on the skeletal mesquite trees. A strange, expectant silence had fallen over the entire ranch. The hands worked with a subdued, quiet efficiency, their eyes occasionally glancing towards the main house, sensing that a significant, life-altering event was about to transpire. Inside, the silence was even more profound, a vacuum filled with the weight of 7 years of grief and a single, terrifying day of hope. Isabel, Mateo, and Calder moved through the hours like actors in a dream, each lost in their own private turmoil, their paths crossing in the hallways and rooms of the house without a word being exchanged. They were waiting. They had accepted the impossible, and now they were waiting for the ghost they had come to believe in to finally give up her name. Anna, the quiet center of this emotional storm, spent the day in a flurry of purposeful, ritualistic activity. She was not merely preparing a meal. She was curating an experience, reconstructing a single, frozen moment in time, with a devotion that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. She scrubbed the dining room floor until the dark wood gleamed. She polished every piece of silver in the house, even pieces that had not been used in a decade, rubbing away the tarnish of years of neglect until they shone with a brilliance that seemed alien in the gloomy, curtained room. She did not use the everyday, cracked blue willow china. Instead, she retrieved Isabel's wedding china from a high, dust-covered cabinet, delicate porcelain plates with a pattern of tiny, hand-painted violets that had not seen the light of day since before the war. Every action was precise, deliberate, a prayer recited in the language of domesticity. Isabel watched her from a distance, her heart a painful, rhythmic ache in her chest. She recognized the girl's movements not as the work of a servant, but as an act of profound, desperate love, an attempt to rebuild a shattered world piece by piece. As dusk began to settle, bleeding purple and orange into the stark western sky, the final preparations were made. Anna set the long, dark table with an almost obsessive attention to detail. 4 places were set, not the customary 2. One for Mateo at the head, one for Isabel at the foot, one for Calder, who had been invited to join them in a silent acknowledgement of his role as protector and witness, and a 4th place, set to Isabel's right. This was Elena's place. It had remained empty for 7 years, a void at the table that was more powerful than any presence. Tonight, it was set with the violet-patterned china, a polished silver cup, and a linen napkin folded into the shape of a long-necked bird. Anna lit the tall beeswax candles in the heavy silver candelabras, and their soft, flickering light pushed back the encroaching shadows, casting a warm, almost sacred glow over the room. The air grew thick with the smells of roasting meat, baked bread, and melting wax. Far off in the distance, a low rumble of thunder could be heard, a promise of a storm that had been threatening for weeks but had yet to break. The heat in the room was stifling, the air unmoving, and the guttering flames of the candles seemed to be the only things that breathed. Mateo, Isabel, and Calder entered the dining room and took their assigned seats. The sight of the fourth place setting, so perfectly and hopefully laid out, was a silent, devastating blow. Mateo's face, which he had struggled to keep composed, finally crumpled. He stared at his daughter's empty chair, and a single, silent tear traced a path through the dust and grime on his weathered cheek. Isabel reached a trembling hand across the table, and he took it, their fingers lacing together in a shared moment of unbearable, exquisite pain. The meal was served. Anna moved with the same silent grace she had displayed since her arrival, but now there was a new and palpable gravity to her movements. She brought out a roast chicken, stuffed with herbs and glistening with juices, a dish that had been Elena's favorite. She served them each a portion, her hands steady, her expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. Then she did something she had not done before. She served a portion onto the fourth plate, the plate at the empty chair, and then, instead of retreating to the kitchen, she walked to that empty chair, pulled it out, and sat down. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the candle flames and the distant, impotent thunder. Anna sat straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the plate before her. She was no longer a maid. She was a daughter, returned to her rightful place at the family table. It was Mateo who finally broke the silence, his voice a ragged whisper. He asked her name. She lifted her head, and her eyes, the same honey-colored eyes as her mother's, met his across the length of the table. She said that for 7 years she had been called Anna. She explained that it was a name that had been given to her, a plain, simple name designed to make her forget the one she had been born with. It was a name that had been a shield, a disguise that had allowed her to survive in a world that had stolen her from her home. She then recounted the story of her capture, her voice low and even, devoid of self-pity. She spoke of the raiders, of the terror and confusion of being torn from her home. She spoke of a long, brutal journey south, towards the border. She described being sold to a wealthy landowner, a man who had wanted a house servant, who had no family, no history, no one to come looking for her. It was this man who had given her the name Anna and had forbidden her from ever speaking her real name again. To speak it, he had warned her, would be to invite a punishment she could not imagine. Her name had to be erased for her to continue to exist. She spoke of the years of servitude, of the quiet, lonely life she had lived in a place that was not her own. She had learned to be silent, to be invisible, to bury her memories so deep within herself that they could not be found. But she had never forgotten. She had held on to the small details of her former life with a fierce, secret tenacity. The taste of her favorite meal, the melody of her father's lullaby, the complex knot of a spur charm. These were the fragments she had used to keep her true self alive in the dark. She paused, and her hand went to the collar of her simple, dark dress. With a steady movement, she undid the top 2 buttons. She pulled the collar aside, exposing the pale skin of her shoulder. There, just below her collarbone, was a brand, a small, intricate design of a stylized M. It was the mark of the man who had owned her, a permanent declaration of his property. The sight of it was a physical blow to Isabel and Mateo, a brutal, undeniable testament to the life their daughter had been forced to endure. It was a scar far deeper than the small, pale crescent above her eye. Then, she reached into a small pocket hidden in the folds of her dress and pulled out a small, tarnished, silver object. It was a locket, heart-shaped and dented. She opened it and held it out. Inside were 2 tiny, faded portraits, one of a younger, happier Isabel, the other of a proud, smiling Mateo. She explained that on the night she was taken, her mother had been mending a tear in the hem of her dress. As a surprise, she had stitched the locket, a secret gift, into the hem, meaning to show it to her in the morning. Elena had not known it was there until weeks later, when she had discovered it by chance. She said that this small, hidden object had been her most precious secret, the one tangible piece of her past she had managed to keep. It was the thing that had reminded her who she was, even when she was forced to be someone else. She had survived by erasing her name, but she had kept the proof of her blood and her love hidden, a silent promise to herself that one day she would find her way back. She had finally escaped 2 months ago, after the man who had owned her had died and his estate had fallen into chaos. She had walked north for weeks, guided by a memory of the stars and an unshakable, instinctual pull towards home. The disguise, the name Anna, had been her armor for so long that she did not know how to take it off. She had come back as a servant because it was the only identity she had known for 7 years. She had needed to see if the home she remembered still existed, if the people in it were the same. She had needed to serve them their daughter in disguise, to see if they would recognize her soul, even when her name and her station had been stripped away. A heavy, profound silence descended upon the room, a silence filled with the weight of her confession. The disguise was not just a dress and a false name. It was a moral reality, a life she had been forced to build in order to endure an unbearable loss. The family had their daughter back, but she was not the child they had lost. She was a woman, remade by her own history, forged in a fire they could only begin to imagine. As they sat there, absorbing the enormity of her story, the fragile peace of the moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses and the sharp, urgent voice of one of the ranch hands calling out from the yard. Calder rose and went to the window, peering out into the moonlit darkness. He turned back to the room, his face grim. He reported that 3 riders were approaching the house. He said he recognized one of them, a man who had been an associate of the landowner from the south. The past, it seemed, was not finished with them yet. The men who had once owned her history had ridden into the county, and the supper of confession was about to become a council of war. The arrival of the 3 riders shattered the fragile, sacred atmosphere of the dining room. The low, distant thunder that had been a faint, atmospheric promise now seemed to have moved directly overhead, a menacing drumbeat that mirrored the sudden, frantic pounding in Isabel's chest. Calder's words hung in the hot, still air, heavy and sharp as stones. The past had not been laid to rest. It had ridden up to their very doorstep, cloaked in the Texas night. Mateo pushed himself to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The sorrow and wonder that had filled his face moments before were now replaced by a mask of grim, protective fury. He moved to a long, narrow cabinet that stood against the wall, a piece of furniture that held not fine china, but his collection of rifles and pistols. The soft, metallic click of him checking the action on a Winchester rifle was a definitive, chilling sound, a declaration that the time for words was over. Through the drawn curtains, they could see the bobbing lights of lanterns as the riders dismounted in the yard. A voice, rough and impatient, called out, demanding to speak with the owner of the ranch. The sound grated on the nerves, an unwelcome intrusion of the coarse, violent world from which their daughter had just escaped. Mateo started for the door, the rifle held loosely but ready in his hand. But it was Isabel who stopped him. She rose and placed a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly firm. In her eyes, a transformation had occurred. The grief-stricken, passive woman who had spent 7 years rocking on the veranda was gone. In her place was a matriarch, her face set with a fierce, unyielding resolve. She had just gotten her daughter back, She would not allow the ghosts of that stolen past to threaten her again. She stated, her voice low but unwavering, that they would not meet violence with violence. Not yet. She insisted that they must first understand what these men wanted. Her words were not a plea, but a command, and Mateo, surprised by the sudden, steely strength in his wife, hesitated. It was Calder who went to the door, his tall, lean frame filling the doorway as he stepped out onto the veranda, blocking the entrance to the house. The family watched from the shadows of the dining room window. They saw 3 men standing in the lantern light, their figures dusty and trail-worn. They were hard-looking men, their faces shadowed by the wide brims of their hats, their hands resting near the pistols holstered at their hips. The man who spoke was the leader, a burly individual with a thick, unkempt beard. He did not introduce himself. He stated his purpose with the blunt arrogance of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He said they were looking for a runaway. He described a young woman named Anna, a servant who had belonged to the estate of his recently deceased employer. He claimed she was a thief, that she had stolen a silver locket before she had fled. He said that they had tracked her to this county and that their inquiries had led them to this ranch. He demanded that they turn her over. The lie was so blatant, so cynically constructed, that it made Isabel's blood run cold. They were not here to reclaim a locket. They were here to reclaim their property. From the shadows of the room, they watched Mateo. He stood just inside the doorway, his face a battleground of conflicting impulses. He was a man of the law, a man who believed in the structures of society. In this new, post-war Texas, the law, however flawed, was the only thing that stood between order and the kind of chaos that had stolen his daughter in the first place. These men, whatever their true intentions, were representatives of a legal claim, however odious. The concept of a runaway servant, a piece of human property, was a deeply ingrained part of the social and legal fabric of their world. To defy them would be to step outside that law, to embrace the very vigilantism he had always disdained. He was caught between his duty as a citizen and his blood instinct as a father. His hesitation was palpable, a moment of agonizing indecision that seemed to stretch for an eternity. It was Isabel who made the choice. She stepped forward, out of the shadows and into the sliver of light from the doorway. She looked at her husband, and in that single, silent glance, a lifetime of shared history and a newfound, unshakable purpose were communicated. She would not allow her daughter to be sacrificed on the altar of a law that had failed to protect her in the first place. Her choice was blood. Her choice was family. Her choice was absolute. Seeing the resolve in his wife's eyes, Mateo's own conflict seemed to resolve. The rancher gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The law of his house would take precedence over the law of the land. The decision was made, but the method was unclear. They were outnumbered. A direct, violent confrontation would be a bloody, uncertain affair. It was then that the girl they had known as Anna, the woman who was Elena, spoke for the first time since the riders had arrived. She stepped forward, her composure as steady and unnerving as ever. The years of servitude had taught her more than just silence and obedience. They had taught her to be a strategist, to understand the minds of men who saw her as less than human. She proposed a ruse. She suggested that she use her own disguise, the very identity they had come to reclaim, one final time. She told them to invite the men in. She said to offer them a meal and whiskey, to treat them as honored guests. She would play the part of the dutiful maid, Anna. She explained that these men were arrogant, that their power came from the belief in their own superiority. They would not suspect a trap laid by a woman they considered to be little more than a piece of furniture. She would serve them, just as she had served her own family. But this time, the service would be a form of judgment. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and it relied entirely on her own courage and her intimate knowledge of her former captors. Calder, standing on the veranda, played his part perfectly. He told the men that his employer, Mr. Alvarado, would be out shortly to speak with them. He invited them to dismount, to come inside and take some refreshment after their long ride. The leader of the group hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. But the offer of whiskey and a hot meal was a powerful lure in this dry, inhospitable land. Calder's calm, almost deferential demeanor seemed to soothe their suspicions. Arrogance won out. The men dismounted and followed Calder into the house, their spurs ringing on the wooden floorboards of the veranda. They were led not into the formal dining room, but into the ranch's parlor, a smaller, more intimate room where Mateo conducted his business. The room was heavy with the scent of leather and old paper, the walls lined with bookshelves and maps of the county. It was a room that spoke of order, of law, of established power. Mateo met them there, his rifle now conspicuously absent. He played the part of the gracious, if weary, host. He expressed his sympathies for their long journey and offered them his best whiskey. The men accepted, their initial aggression softening into a swaggering confidence. They believed they were in control, that they were negotiating from a position of strength with a reasonable, law-abiding landowner. While they drank and spoke with Mateo, their voices low and conspiratorial, Isabel and her daughter worked quickly in the dining room. The remnants of their own interrupted supper were cleared away. The table was reset. 3 new places were laid, with the same fine china and polished silver. It was a decoy, a stage being set for a final, public performance. Night had now fallen completely. The heat of the day had finally begun to recede, but the air was still and heavy with the promise of the coming storm. The wind had begun to pick up, rattling the dry mesquite branches against the side of the house, a restless, percussive sound. The stock pens creaked in the hot wind, and the sun, long set, had left behind a sky of bruised purple and black. The shadows in the yard were knife-sharp in the stark, white light of a rising moon. The house was a small, isolated island of light and tension in the vast, dark expanse of the Texas plains. When the stage was set, Elena, still wearing the mask of Anna, entered the parlor. She carried a tray with a fresh bottle of whiskey and 3 clean glasses. She moved with her head down, her movements submissive and silent, the perfect image of a servant. The men barely glanced at her, their attention focused on Mateo. The leader of the group, his tongue loosened by the whiskey, was explaining the legalities of the situation, speaking of contracts and property rights. Elena placed the tray on a small table and, in a low, respectful voice, informed Mateo that supper was ready to be served. It was the cue. Mateo rose and, with an air of gracious hospitality, invited his guests to join him at the table. He told them that they could conclude their business over a proper meal. The men, their bellies warm with whiskey and their minds clouded with arrogance, readily agreed. They followed him out of the parlor and into the long hallway that led to the dining room. They were walking, unknowing, towards a tribunal. The maid they had come to reclaim was about to serve them a reckoning, and the family that had been broken by the past was now united, ready to stand as witnesses and judges. The transition from confession to consequence was complete. The night of reckoning was about to begin at the supper table. The 3 riders entered the dining room with the swagger of men who believed they had already won. They saw a table laden with food, illuminated by the soft, benevolent glow of candlelight, and they interpreted it as a sign of their host's capitulation. Their arrogance was a thick, foul cloak, rendering them blind to the subtle, dangerous currents in the room. They took the seats indicated by Mateo, placing themselves at the side of the long table, a position that unknowingly cast them as petitioners before a panel of judges. Matteo sat at the head of the table, no longer the wavering, conflicted man from the parlor, but a patriarch in full, indisputable command of his domain. Isabel sat at the opposite end, her posture as rigid and unyielding as a queen on her throne, her honey-colored eyes, the same eyes as her daughter, fixed on the intruders with a cold, unwavering intensity. And Calder stood, not by the door like a guard, but near the sideboard, his presence a silent, formidable statement of loyalty and witness. He was not a servant. He was a member of the family, a part of this tribunal. The men, oblivious to the carefully orchestrated stagecraft, began to eat and drink, their table manners as coarse as their speech. They spoke amongst themselves, their voices loud and confident, already discussing how they would spend the bounty they had been promised for the return of the runaway. Elena, still in the guise of the meek and invisible Anna, moved silently around the table. She refilled their wine glasses, her movements fluid and precise. She served them bread, her head bowed, her face in shadow. The leader of the group, a man named Marcus, emboldened by the whiskey and the fine meal, reached out and grabbed her wrist as she passed. It was a casual, proprietary gesture, the thoughtless action of a man asserting his ownership. He looked up at her, a leering, triumphant smile on his face. He told her that her little holiday was over. It was in that moment that the performance ended and the reckoning began. Elena did not pull her hand away. Instead, she let her arm go still, and she slowly, deliberately, lifted her head. She looked Marcus directly in the eye. The submissive, downcast gaze of the servant was gone, replaced by a look of such cold, clear, and absolute condemnation that the man's smile faltered on his lips. His hand fell away from her wrist as if he had been burned. A sudden, shocked silence fell over the table. The scraping of chairs on the wooden floor and the clatter of silverware ceased. Even the moths, which had been beating their wings against the glass of the window panes, seemed to go still. The wind outside rose to a low, mournful howl, and the first cool draft of the approaching storm snaked its way into the room, making the candle flames dance wildly, casting frantic, distorted shadows upon the walls. Elena did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words, when they came, were spoken in the same low, even tone she had used since her arrival, but they were now infused with a steel that cut through the silence like a razor. She began to speak, and she addressed Marcus by his full name. She named him not as a servant addressing a master, but as a victim identifying her tormentor. She recounted, in plain, unadorned detail, a night 3 years prior, in a small, windowless room, used for storing linens at the back of his employer's house. She described the precise pattern of the water stains on the ceiling. She spoke of the smell of mildew and lavender soap. She reported the exact words he had whispered to her, the vile promises of what he would do to the younger kitchen maid if she cried out. She spoke with a chilling, factual detachment, her account so specific, so filled with irrefutable details of time and place, that the color drained from Marcus's face. He was no longer a bounty hunter. He was a common criminal, his crimes laid bare at a stranger's dinner table. He tried to speak, to form a denial, but his mouth only opened and closed, producing no sound. He was a man unmasked, his power, which had been built on the silence of his victims, evaporating under the light of a truth spoken aloud. She then turned her gaze to the second man, a thin, sallow individual named Jasper. He had been watching the exchange with a growing, rodent-like fear in his eyes. Elena named him, and his flinch was a confession in itself. She stated that she knew he was the one who kept the books. She was not referring to the accounts of the estate. She was referring to a different set of ledgers, small, leather-bound books filled with names, ages, and prices. She had seen these books, had been forced to dust the desk on which they were kept. She recounted a specific entry she had seen, one from 4 years ago. She described a transaction, the sale of a boy of 12, an orphan from a failed farmstead east of the river. She recited the price paid, 25 silver dollars, and the name of the buyer, a man known to run a brutal mining operation across the border. She described the boy, mentioning a distinctive scar on his left hand from a childhood accident with a hatchet, a detail she had overheard Jasper discussing with the buyer. It was a detail that could only be known by someone who had been there, who had listened from the shadows. Jasper began to tremble, his hands shaking so violently that his wineglass tipped, spilling a dark red stain across the white linen tablecloth, like a pool of spreading blood. His crime was not one of passion or drunken lust, but something colder, more systematic, the quiet, orderly commodification of human misery. Finally, her unblinking gaze fell upon the third man, a thick-necked brute named Silas, who had remained silent throughout, his confidence slowly eroding into a sullen, dangerous anger. As she named him, he pushed his chair back, his hand inching towards the pistol at his hip. But before he could move, Calder took a single, deliberate step away from the sideboard, a silent, deadly promise of intervention that froze Silas in his seat. Elena's voice was at its quietest as she spoke to him, a tone that was somehow more menacing than any shout. She did not accuse him of a crime against her. She accused him of a crime she had witnessed. She spoke of an old stable hand, a man named Abram, who had been caught trying to help a young girl escape. She described the beating that followed, not as a distant memory, but as a clinical report. She detailed the weapon Silas had used, a splintered axe handle. She described the sounds and the eventual, terrible silence. She stated the location of the unmarked grave where Abram had been buried, a shallow pit dug in the dry earth behind the smokehouse. She finished by saying that she had seen him laughing afterwards. At this, Silas finally broke. With a roar of pure, cornered rage, he lunged to his feet, overturning his chair. But he was not fast enough. Calder moved with the swift, lethal grace of a striking snake, and the heavy barrel of a Colt revolver appeared in his hand, leveled directly at Silas's chest. The man froze, his face a mask of thwarted violence. The reckoning was complete. The three men were broken, their authority shattered, their vile secrets exposed to the cold, unforgiving light of the dining room. They were no longer hunters, they were prey, trapped and revealed for what they were. Matteo rose to his feet, his face carved from granite. He looked at the three men with a profound, almost biblical contempt. He did not issue a threat of violence. His judgment was more subtle and far more devastating. He told them that his daughter would be prepared to give a full and detailed deposition of their crimes to the county sheriff, a man Matteo knew to be honest and unyielding. He explained that her testimony, with its unimpeachable detail, would be more than enough to see them all hang. Or, he offered, they could simply ride. They could get on their horses, leave his land, and never return. They could take their chances in a world where their reputations and their network of intimidation had been compromised. He made it clear that if they chose to ride, he would not stop them, but if their faces were ever seen in this county again, the deposition would be delivered. It was a sentence of exile, a form of solemn mercy that was also a life sentence of looking over their shoulders. There was no choice to be made. Marcus was the first to his feet, his face pale and slick with sweat. He stumbled away from the table, not daring to look at anyone. Jasper followed, practically crawling over his overturned chair in his haste to escape. Silas was the last, his murderous rage having collapsed into a sullen, impotent shame. He cast one last, hate-filled glance at Elena before turning to follow the others. Calder escorted them to the door, his pistol never wavering. The family listened as the men fumbled with their saddles, their movements clumsy with fear. They heard the frantic, desperate sound of their horses galloping away into the night, the sound growing fainter and fainter until it was finally swallowed by the rising howl of the wind. The threat was gone. Calder closed and bolted the heavy front door, the sound of the iron bolt sliding home a final, definitive seal against the outside world. He returned to the dining room. The storm, which had been threatening all night, finally broke. A sudden, violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and then came the rain, a torrential downpour that struck the roof in a great, cleansing wave. The sound filled the room, a wild, cathartic roar that seemed to wash away the filth of the last hour, of the last 7 years. For a long moment, the four of them simply stood in the wreckage of the tribunal, the overturned chair, the spilled wine, the guttering candles. Then, Isabel moved. She walked the length of the table and wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her not with the desperation of a mother who had found what was lost, but with the profound, quiet pride of a woman embracing an equal. Matteo walked to the table. He picked up the plate that had been set for Anna, the plate that had been served to the ghost of a servant. He carried it to the sideboard. Then he returned with a clean plate from his wife's wedding china, one of the ones with the pattern of violets. He placed it carefully at his daughter's seat. It was a small, simple gesture, but it was everything. It was an acknowledgement, a reconsecration. The place was no longer for a maid, or a runaway, or a victim. It was for a daughter, a survivor, a hero. He had set a new place at the table, and in doing so, he had remade his family. The next morning, the world was new. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky that was scrubbed clean and a deep, resonant blue. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and life renewed. The months of heat and dust had been washed away. Isabel stood on the veranda, breathing in the clean air, her face turned towards the sunrise. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see her daughter emerge from the house. The girl was no longer wearing the drab, dark dress of a servant. She was wearing one of Isabel's old dresses, a simple gown of pale yellow that brought the color back to her cheeks. She looked like the dawn. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out over the transformed landscape. Then, Isabel spoke her name, not the name of the ghost, Anna, but the name of her child. She said it softly, letting the syllables settle in the cool morning air. She said the name Elena, and her daughter, for the first time since returning home, smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it was a beginning, reclaimed from the ruins of the past. On the hard, unforgiving roads of Texas, a name could be a brand or a prayer, a chain or a compass. For Elena Alvarado, after a long and brutal journey through the wilderness, her name was finally a home that patience, courage, and a love that refused to die had built anew. The ledger on the Alvarado Ranch is now closed. Your presence here has given weight to a name that was almost lost to the dust. If you wish to stand with us when the next forgotten record is opened, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive and tell us in the comments what justice, for you, looks like.